Before refrigerators and chemical preservatives, survival depended on knowing how to make food last through wars, famines, harsh winters, and long journeys. In medieval times, the art of preserving food wasn't just practical, it was life or death. What's more surprising, many of these ancient methods still work today. These weren't crude tricks, they were carefully honed techniques passed through generations. From buried cheese sealed in wax to fermented fish that could outlast a siege. This story isn't just about food, it's about resilience, survival, and forgotten knowledge that modern science is only now beginning to appreciate. Salt, in the medieval world, was not just a mineral, it was leverage. Its presence could determine the fate of a city, its control, the strength of a kingdom. In an age without refrigeration, salt was essential for survival. It preserved meat through winter, kept fish edible for weeks on long sea voyages, and turned perishable harvests into stores that could last for months. It wasn't simply about taste, it was about continuity. Without it, armies would starve, and populations would dwindle under the pressure of scarcity in Western Europe. Salting meat was standard practice among those who could afford it. Pork, in particular, was heavily salted after slaughter, packed into wooden barrels, and stored in cellars where it would keep for the cold months ahead. Fish, especially cod and herring, became cornerstones of preservation. Herring from the North Sea, caught in massive quantities, was cleaned, layered with salt, and then shipped inland, feeding inland populations hundreds of miles from any coast. But salt wasn't abundant everywhere. Its scarcity created monopolies and shaped entire trade networks. One of the earliest and most important sources was the salt pans of Venice and the marshes of western France. In the Mediterranean, sea salt was harvested from evaporated coastal ponds, while inland Europe depended on rock salt mined from places like Salzburg, literally meaning salt fortress. These mining towns were often wealthy, guarded, and politically significant. Control over salt routes became a source of conflict and diplomacy. The Via Salaria in ancient Italy, still active in medieval times, was named after the salt it transported to Rome in France. The gabelle tax, introduced in the 14th century under Philip VI, made salt a state-controlled commodity. It wasn't a minor levy. It was deeply resented, enforced brutally, and widely evaded. Smuggling salt became a criminal enterprise. Those caught could be imprisoned, flogged, or worse. During the Ancien regime, resentment over the gabelle would fuel wider discontent leading up to the French Revolution. In England, salt production developed along the coasts and in inland areas like Cheshire, where brine springs allowed for boiling salt from underground water. These salt works were labor-intensive and regulated by guilds. By the 11th century, salt's role had already been codified in law and economy. In the Domesday Book of 1086, salt pans are mentioned specifically, indicating both their value and administrative importance. Beyond Europe, salt routes stretched across continents. The Sahara salt caravans, led by camel trains crossing vast deserts, brought slabs of salt to West Africa. In some regions, salt was traded ounce for ounce with gold. Cities like Timbuktu rose as a result of this exchange. Though outside medieval Europe, the pattern was global. Salt meant power in monasteries. Salt was essential to religious dietary restrictions. During Lent, when meat was forbidden, salted fish, especially herring, became a staple. Its preservation made it accessible throughout Christendom, linking rural communities to larger trade systems. Centered on ecclesiastical calendars, salt's function as a preservative made it indispensable. but its role in society made it transformative. It wasn't just in the kitchen, it was in the laws, in the wars, in the treaties, and in the taxes. It traveled by sea, over land, and underground. And in a medieval world where the margin between feast and famine was thin, salt was not optional. It was survival, and control over it, in many ways, defined the balance of power. In medieval Europe, fire meant survival, but smoke became something more. Across villages and towns, from the Scandinavian coasts to the hills of Bavaria, smoke wasn't just a byproduct of cooking. It was a calculated tool used not to flavor, but to preserve. When meat or fish needed to last beyond a few days, smoke offered a shield against rot, bacteria, and pests. The knowledge behind it wasn't accidental. It was observed, tested, and passed down over generations. The basic process was deceptively simple. Hang meat over a low fire, expose it to smoke, and wait. But the execution varied widely. In northern climates, cold smoking was preferred. Temperatures stayed low, and the process could stretch over weeks. This slow exposure dehydrated the meat, sealed its surface, and infused it with antimicrobial compounds like formaldehyde and phenol. Cold smoked hams, like the famous Black Forest variety from what is now southwestern Germany, trace their lineage to these methods. Further south, where climates were warmer, hot smoking was more common. It cooked the meat while preserving it, creating products that could be eaten soon after but still last longer than fresh cuts. In rural Italy and parts of the Balkans, smoking pork and sausages in warm smokehouses became routine before winter. These structures were built from stone or wood, with a small hearth at the base and hooks near the ceiling. Smoke was directed through narrow vents, rising slowly, saturating the meat. Above, the architecture of smokehouses reflected local materials and climate. In Scandinavian regions, entire log cabins were dedicated to smoking, often attached to or located behind the home. In England, especially in the eastern counties, wooden smokehouses stood in backyards or near butcher shops. Their blackened interiors told the story of years of use layered with creosote, hardened by time. Fish smoking became vital along coastlines. In the Low Countries and along the North Sea, herring was caught in enormous quantities, cleaned quickly, and smoked in tall chimneys designed specifically for the task. In Scotland, the Arbroath smoky developed as a solution to quick preservation. Hot smoked haddock, cured and ready within hours. Born out of necessity among coastal fishing families. Smoke rituals, too, existed within guilds. In German-speaking areas, butchers' guilds passed down techniques for exact smoking times, wood selection, and preparation. Oak, beech, and alder were common, each producing a different type of smoke, some harsher, some sweeter. The type of wood used wasn't for taste alone determined the effectiveness of the preservation. Resin-heavy softwoods like pine were avoided, as they produced bitter, sooty smoke. By the 13th century, smoked goods weren't just for preservation, they had entered trade. Smoked sausages, smoked cheeses, and smoked fish traveled across Europe. In city markets from Krakow to Paris, these foods were not luxuries, they were necessities for winter, for soldiers on the march, for monasteries observing fasts. Behind the smoke was a system, technique, adaptation, and repetition. It protected communities from spoilage. It allowed food to be stored, shipped, and eaten long after harvest or slaughter. And in a time when spoilage could mean starvation, the smokehouse wasn't a luxury. It was insurance. Long before canning, freezing, or vacuum sealing, preservation relied on a simple principle: remove moisture, and decay slows down. In the medieval world, drying food was one of the most practical and widespread methods of extending shelf life. It required no salt, no fire, no metal tools, just the sun, the wind, and time. Whether in settled towns or among nomadic tribes, drying offered a way to keep food edible through seasons of scarcity. In southern Europe, sun-drying became routine, especially in regions like Sicily, Provence, and Al-Andalus. Grapes became raisins. Figs shriveled into dense packets of sugar and fiber. And tomatoes, introduced later from the New World, would eventually follow the same logic. Farmers built slatted racks out of wood or stretched mesh from woven plant fibers, raised above the ground to avoid dirt and pests. These platforms were placed in open courtyards or terraced hillsides, angled toward maximum sunlight. But sunlight alone wasn't always dependable. In wetter or colder regions, drying required air circulation more than heat. Wind drying took over in the British Isles, Scandinavia, and the Alpine Highlands. Cod, for example, was caught in the North Atlantic and dried on open-air racks in places like Iceland and northern Norway. Known as stockfish, these stiff, lightweight slabs of fish could last for years. By the 12th century, they were traded throughout Europe, becoming essential food for Lent and long-distance travelers. The structures used for wind drying varied by region. In Iceland, wooden frames, called hallar, were constructed from driftwood, elevated and built to withstand the harsh coastal winds. Fish were cleaned, split, and hung by their tails in long rows, drying slowly in cold, salty air. These weren't temporary measures. Whole communities timed their work around drying seasons, sometimes overlapping with other agricultural calendars. For meat, the drying process had more variation. In mountainous areas like the Pyrenees or Carpathians, thinly sliced strips of venison, mutton, or goat were hung from rafters or strung along interior beams, where smoke from the hearth and dry indoor air aided preservation. In Central Asia, nomadic cultures relied heavily on dried meat, often pounded into portable forms like borts, a Mongolian staple. Strips of beef were dried in the open, then crushed and stored in sacks, light enough to carry on horseback across vast distances. Even dairy saw limited use of drying. In Switzerland, curds were sometimes pressed, aged, and further dried to form hard cheeses that could survive for months. Bread, too, was occasionally dried into hard rusks, durable and long-lasting, especially for soldiers or pilgrims on the move. Drying was rarely seen as exceptionally, was routine, embedded in daily life. It required attention to weather, timing, airflow, and pests. But when done correctly, it meant security. Food that would otherwise rot in days could last for months, sometimes years. In the fragile economies of medieval Europe and beyond, that difference could determine whether a household endured winter or didn't. In medieval Europe, pickling was more than a kitchen routine. It was a preservation strategy rooted in necessity and shaped by climate, religion, and class. Long before the microscope revealed bacteria or the word microbe was coined, people understood one thing clearly: food left exposed would rot, but soaked in brine or submerged in vinegar, it could last for months, sometimes longer. In regions where winters halted harvests and travel, that was more than convenience, it was survival. Brine, made from water saturated with salt, was the simpler and older method. Vegetables like cabbage, turnips, onions, and cucumbers were layered. into large ceramic crocks or wooden barrels submerged under salt water, and weighed down with stones or wooden lids to keep them fully covered. The salt not only drew moisture out of the produce, it created an environment hostile to harmful bacteria while encouraging fermentation by lactic acid bacterium, invisible transformation that preserved food and sometimes even improved its nutritional value. In the colder months, brined vegetables became central to meals in both rural homes and monastic communities. In monasteries across Europe, particularly in Benedictine and Cistercian orders, food had to be stored with long-term planning. Silence and simplicity were core values, but so was self-sufficiency. Pickled beets, onions, and herbs lined stone cellars alongside barrels of salted fish and dried legumes. Inventories were carefully monitored. In places like the Abbey of St. Gall in present-day Switzerland, monastic records even detailed food quantities stored for winter and fasts, including pickled items. Vinegar-based pickling came with more variation. In noble households, where resources and spices were more available, vinegar was often infused with mustard seed, dill, garlic, or peppercorns. Eggs boiled and peeled were sometimes pickled this way for preservation, their texture altered but shelf life extended. Meats were occasionally pickled as well, especially when salting was either insufficient or when additional flavor and acidity were desired. Pork and tongue were known to be preserved in vinegar, sometimes with the addition of wine or ale. Pickling also had a liturgical function. The Christian calendar imposed long fasting periods, particularly during Lent. For 40 days, meat, dairy, and even animal fats were restricted. Pickled vegetables, along with fish, provided one of the few flavorful and filling options that complied with religious rules. The Church, especially from the 9th century onward, enforced these dietary restrictions strictly across much of Europe. Failure to observe them could be seen as both spiritual neglect and social defiance. In wealthier households, pickled produce also became a marker of preparation and refinement. A well-stocked larder was not only practical, it signaled competence. Recipes began appearing in manuscripts like the Form of Cury, commissioned by the court of Richard II in the late 14th century. Though largely focused on cooked dishes, it included references to preserved ingredients, many of which were pickled. Whether in the stone cellars of abbeys, the pantries of merchant homes, or the barrels packed onto ships, pickled food was trusted to endure time. Vinegar and brine didn't just change the flavor, they created a margin of safety in a world where one bad winter, one failed harvest, or one siege could turn food into memory. In medieval Europe, fermentation wasn't fully understood, but it was relied upon. No one saw microbes or measured pH levels, yet the process became central to survival, culture, and economy. Through observation, instinct, and trial, communities learned to work with what appeared to be raw ingredients into foods that not only lasted longer, but became staples of daily life. Bread, for example, was more than nourishment. In most regions, it was the foundation of every meal. But without commercial yeast, bakers depended on natural fermentation. Wild yeasts from the air and flour activated in moist dough created sourdough starters, slow to rise, unpredictable, but consistent enough once mastered. Each region, even each household, developed a unique microbial fingerprint. Monasteries and urban bakeries guarded their starters, treating them almost like property. In Paris, by the 13th century, the baking guilds were already codifying rules around fermentation, ensuring standards that would carry into the Renaissance. Cheese followed a similar logic. Milk spoils quickly, but when soured, curdled, and aged in cool caves or cellars, it transforms. From the pungent blue-veined Roquefort, aged in the Combalou caves of southern France, to hard wheels of Alpine cheese ripened for seasons. Fermentation preserved milk for long stretches and created products valuable enough for trade. Regions like Normandy, Lombardy, and the Swiss cantons became known for their cheeses not because they understood bacteria, but because they mastered conditions. Salting, pressing, and aging were adjusted through experience, producing consistent results long before science explained why it worked. Beer was another product of this controlled decay. In monastic breweries across the Holy Roman Empire and Low Countries, fermentation transformed boiled grain into ale drink safer than most water. The Benedictine and Cistercian monks, beginning around the 9th century, refined techniques that allowed beer to last through storage and travel. Some of the earliest records of hopped beer come from the Abbey of St. Gallen in Switzerland and later from Weihenstephan in Bavaria, now home to the world's oldest operating brewery. Hops, introduced more widely by the 12th century, acted as both a preservative and flavoring agent, extending shelf life and enabling regional export. Not all fermented foods were luxurious or crafted in cloisters. In the Nordic world, fish was buried or stored in barrels to fermentrise salting in products like surströmming in Sweden or rakefisk in Norway. The smell was sharp, the process imprecise, but it made preserved protein possible in regions where drying alone wasn't enough. In Iceland, Hakal fermented shark was made from Greenland shark. Toxic when fresh but rendered edible through fermentation and months of air-drying. Across Europe, fermentation straddled the line between preservation and transformation. It allowed food to endure travel, survive winters, and nourish larger populations. It was a process few could explain, but many perfected. Without modern labs, people relied on repetition, weather, taste, and smell. The wisdom was passed hand to hand, not through theory but through action. What looked like spoilage became security, and some of those same methods, refined in medieval kitchens and cellars, are still used in modern ones today. In medieval Europe, the absence of refrigeration didn't mean the absence of cold storage. Long before compressors and electricity, people turned to the landscape itself, to stone, earth, snow, and shadow. Across the continent, food was preserved not by machinery, but by architecture shaped to trap cold and slow time. Underground cellars were the most widespread solution. Dug beneath homes, monasteries, and castles, these chambers offered stable temperatures throughout the year. In regions with distinct seasons, the earth kept interiors cool in summer and above freezing in winter. The deeper the cellar, the more constant the temperature. Thick stone walls, vaulted ceilings, and narrow ventilation shafts helped control humidity and air circulation. In wine-producing regions like Burgundy and the Rhine Valley, these cellars were essential not just for aging wine, but for storing cheese, butter, cured meat, pickled vegetables, and grains. Noble estates and larger institutions took storage further. Castles like Crac des Chevaliers in the Levant or Warwick Castle in England featured massive larders carved into bedrock, sealed with wooden doors reinforced with iron. Some included gravel-lined floors to absorb moisture and prevent rot. In northern Italy, wealthy merchant families constructed underground ice pizzicature. Winter snow was packed with straw and preserved for use into the warmer months. Monasteries, especially those following the Benedictine rule, often engineered complex storage systems. At Cluny Abbey in France or Monte Cassino in Italy, the combination of root cellars, spring-fed cooling basins, and shaded storerooms reflected a systematic approach to preservation. These spaces weren't simply cold, they were designed with purpose. Meat was hung in the driest corners. Liquids were kept near stone to reduce spoilage. Even lighting was. Controlled windows were small, if present at all, to keep out sun and pests. In colder climates, ice itself was harvested. During winter, large blocks were cut from frozen lakes or rivers, wrapped in straw or sawdust, and stored. In ice houses, insulated pits, or stone structures built partially underground. In Scandinavia, parts of Eastern Europe, and even in England by the 14th century. These ice houses were often located near the kitchens of aristocratic estates. They extended the shelf life of perishable foods through the spring and sometimes into early summer. These structures reflect a kind of environmental engineering. Without modern technology, communities adapted architecture to their local climate, creating microclimates beneath their homes and estates. It was a form of passive refrigeration, simple, effective, and essential. In an age when food insecurity was a constant threat, the ability to delay decay meant not just comfort, but resilience. In a world without refrigeration, air was the enemy. Exposure meant oxidation, decay, and eventually loss. But in medieval, kitchens from peasant homes to noble estates, there was a method to shut air out entirely: preservation through fat. The technique was simple but effective. Cooked meat was submerged in its own rendered fat and stored in earthenware or ceramic pots. Once the fat cooled and solidified, it formed a natural seal, cutting off oxygen and preventing bacterial growth. This barrier kept the meat moist and edible for weeks, sometimes months, depending on conditions. It required no rare ingredients, no elaborate tools, just time, care, and understanding of how meat and fat behaved after heat. This method produced what came to be known as potted meat in English sources, and confit the French-speaking world. The word confit, from the Latin confisere, meaning to prepare or to preserve, referred originally to fruits preserved in sugar or syrup. But by the 13th century, it was being used for savory foods, particularly duck, goose, or pork cooked slowly in fat and sealed beneath that same fat for storage. In southwestern France, particularly in Gascony, confit became standard practice. Ducks and geese raised for their fat and meat were slaughtered in winter, when ambient temperatures helped preservation. The meat was seasoned, cooked gently in its own fat, and stored in large stone crocks in cool cellars. This wasn't luxury, it was strategy. It allowed rural families to preserve protein through lean seasons and ensured that food could be prepared quickly even when fresh meat was unavailable. England had its own version. Household manuals from the late medieval period described meats boiled or roasted, then packed into jars and covered with clarified fattifade from beef or mutton. In some cases, the fat was topped with cloth soaked in alcohol or vinegar to discourage mold. These potted meats were stored in pantries, taken on journeys, or held in reserve for winter months. The method traveled well. It required no special climate and little more than a fire, a knife, and a pot. Even small households without ice pits or smokehouses could preserve leftover roasts this way. And because the fat itself was reusable, it became part of a cycle: melted down, reheated, skimmed, and used again. Fat sealing wasn't just about preservation. It was a practical application of observation. of noticing how meat kept longer under grease, how spoilage slowed when air was removed. In a medieval world that knew hunger well, it offered more than convenience. It offered continuity. In the medieval world, honey held a reputation that extended far beyond sweetness. It was food, medicine, offering, and preservative used in monasteries, market stalls, and royal courts alike. Long before the microbial science behind it was understood, people recognized its value. Honey resisted spoilage. It did not rot, mold, or ferment under ordinary conditions. Its low moisture content and high acidity made it naturally hostile to bacteria, and that made it invaluable. Across Europe, honey was used to preserve fruits at harvest. Figs, dates, quinces, and even citrus where available was sliced, gently dried, and submerged in honey. In cooler regions, apples and berries were layered into clay pots, then covered completely. The honey formed a seal, while infusing the contents with its antimicrobial protection. When sugar was still a luxury rare and imported in small quantities. From the East, honey was the primary sweetener, and for most, the only available preservative for delicate fruits. But preservation wasn't limited to plants. In some cases, meat was also stored in honey. This was rarer due to cost, but documented. In households of high status, game birds or small cuts of pork were cooked, cooled, and sealed in large glazed jars filled with honey. Recipes recorded in texts like the Liber de Coquina, a 14th century culinary manuscript with likely French and Neapolitan origins, described meat layered with herbs and submerged in honey for both flavor and longevity. These preparations were not only for sustenance, but also for gifting, travel, or feasts during leaner seasons. Monasteries across Europe used honey extensively not only in kitchens, but in infirmaries. Benedictine and Cistercian herbal manuals listed honey as a binding agent in salves and an active ingredient in wound care. Combined with herbs like sage, garlic, or mustard seed, it was applied to burns, ulcers, and infections. The knowledge was based on observation. Wounds treated with honey were less likely to fester. Modern studies would later confirm what these communities had already learned through practice. Honey also carried symbolic weight. In Christian tradition, it was linked to purity and divine favor. Beekeeping became a monastic art, especially in France, Germany, and the British Isles, at Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire. Surviving ledgers note the maintenance of multiple hives and the distribution of honey for both liturgical and medicinal use. Bees were tended carefully, their hives placed near orchards or herb gardens. Honey collected in early summer was often reserved for feast days or stored in cellars as an essential winter good. Its long shelf life, versatility, and symbolic importance made honey a staple of preservation in a world without modern tools. It didn't just extend the life of food. It represented knowledge, hard-earned, practical, and deeply interwoven with the rhythms of medieval survival. In medieval Europe, alcohol was more than a drink, it was preservation in liquid form. Across abbeys, manor houses, and rural farms, alcohol extended the life of perishables and protected what would otherwise spoil. The process didn't begin with chemistry, it began with observation. Left undisturbed, fruit juice fermented, grains turned to ale. Over time, these liquids were found to resist rot, deter pests, and, when used properly, preserve. Fruits and roots were among the first to be stored in alcohol. Cherries, plums, pears, and herbs were soaked in mead, brandy, or sweet wine. The result was twofold. The solids became infused with alcohol and retained their form for weeks or months, while the liquid took on the flavor of the preserved ingredients. Monastic communities, especially in regions like Burgundy, Flanders, and Saxony, documented such mixtures as early as the 12th century. Alcohol acted as both solvent and barriers, saturating the food, inhibiting microbial growth, and making it safe for longer-term storage. In wealthier households, kitchen staff prepared jars of spiced pears, preserved in fortified wine or distilled spirits. These concoctions weren't just for winter reserves. They were served at feasts, sent as gifts, and used in remedies. Root vegetables, ginger, horseradish, even garlic were occasionally stored in alcohol, particularly in areas where vinegar was less available or more expensive. Alcohol also played a role in preserving meat, though less commonly. Small game or organ meats were sometimes steeped in strong wine or ale, combined with spices and sealed in ceramic jars. The alcohol slowed bacterial growth and, in some cases, masked the smell or taste of aging flesh. These preparations were more prevalent in military camps or among travelers, where conditions demanded portable and semi-durable food. Mead and ale served another role. Beyond the cellar, they were safer than water. Streams near villages were often polluted, and drinking untreated water carried risk. Alcoholic drinks, even low in strength, reduced microbial threats. Monasteries became centers of brewing, not just for commerce, but for health. The rule of Saint Benedict even encouraged moderate drinking, acknowledging its practical role in daily life. Monks at places like the Abbey of St. Gall maintained detailed brewing logs, refining recipes that preserved and nourished. Alcohol didn't just preserve food. It preserves safety, trust, and access. One more solution in a world that had to outthink time. In the quieter corners of medieval life, preservation relied not on heat or salt, but on barriers sealed and packed into place. Clay, ash, and wax offered a final line of defense. These materials didn't alter the food, they protected it. They created walls between perishable goods and the air, insects, and damp that would destroy them. Cheese sealed in wax became common. In regions where humidity or pests made aging unpredictable, after the curd was pressed and aged to the desired firmness, it was dipped in beeswax layer after layer until the surface was smooth and airtight. This coating preserved moisture, repelled insects, and prevented mold growth. Monastic communities in regions like Normandy and Flanders documented these techniques as early as the 13th century. Cheeses prepared this way could be stored en route. Cellars for months, often transported over long distances without spoiling. Eggs presented a different challenge. Once laid, they began degrading quickly without refrigeration, but dipped in ash or stored in lime water, their shells remained sealed and firm. Wood ash, fine and dry, filled the pores of the eggshell, limiting exposure to oxygen and moisture. In England, this technique was practiced well into the early modern period, particularly on farms during peak laying seasons. Lime water, made by soaking quicklime in water, had a similar effect, forming a mild, alkaline bath that hardened the shell and delayed decay. These methods kept eggs viable for several months, often enough to carry through winter. Grains and pulses were sealed in clay pots, sometimes lined with straw or leaves, then covered with tightly packed lids and sealed with mud. In areas like the Balkans and the Iberian Peninsula, families stored beans, lentils, barley, and wheat this way, often burying the pots for added insulation. These vessels were retrieved as needed, their contents still dry and usable. The concept wasn't unique to Europe. Similar practices existed across Persia and North Africa, but the medieval adaptation matched local needs, especially in regions without large-scale granaries. Though many of these techniques faded with industrial food systems, some remain. Wax-sealed cheeses are still crafted in rural France and the Netherlands. Lime-preserved eggs are used in parts of Eastern Europe and China. The tools may be simple, but the results endure. For centuries, these materials didn't just store food, they bought time.